Picture this, a vast medieval battlefield where the air is thick with the scent of iron and sweat, where the earth trembles under the charge of armored knights. But look closer, and you'll see something history often overlooks. Women standing shoulder to shoulder with men, their swords gleaming, their voices ringing out commands. These were not anomalies or myths. They were real women, warriors, leaders, strategists, who the rigid expectations of their time to carve their names into the annals of history. Yet for centuries, their stories were buried, their bravery dismissed as legend or outright erased. Why? Because their very existence challenged the narratives that painted women as passive, fragile, or confined to the shadows. Today, we're pulling back the veil on these extraordinary figures, uncovering the truth behind their battles, their sacrifices, and the societies that both feared and needed them. Think about the medieval world as you've been taught: kings, knights, castles, and chivalry. But where are the women? Too often, they're reduced to damsels in distress or silent figures in the background. Yet, hidden in the cracks of history are accounts of women who took up arms, who led armies into battle, who negotiated peace treaties, and who ruled with the same iron will as their male counterparts. Take of Arc, for instance. Her name might be familiar, but she was far from alone. Across Europe, from the of Scandinavia to the warrior queens of Spain, women fought, bled, and changed the course of history. Their stories are not just footnotes. They are testaments to a resilience and courage that transcended the limits imposed on them. So why have these women been forgotten or diminished? The answer lies in the hands of those who wrote history, chroniclers, monks, and scholars who often saw the world through the lens of their own biases. A woman wielding power was a threat to the established order, and so her legacy was softened, twisted, or erased entirely. But the fragments that remain are enough to piece together a different narrative, one where women were not just bystanders, but active shapers of their destinies. This video is a journey into that hidden past, a chance to meet the women who refused to be silenced, who stood tall in a world that told them to kneel. By the end, you'll see medieval Europe not as a monolithic era of male dominance, but as a tapestry woven with the threads of countless brave women whose stories demand to be heard. Ready to uncover the truth? Let's begin. Consider the weight of a medieval scribe's quill, how a single stroke could elevate a king's glory or erase a woman's defiance from memory. For centuries, the stories of warrior women were systematically filtered through the narrow lens of those who controlled the written word. Monastic chroniclers, often bound by religious doctrine, portrayed battle as a sacred masculine duty, while women who took up arms were labeled as aberrations, either divine miracles like of Arc or monstrous anomalies like the fictionalized Valkyries. Even when evidence of their existence surfaced, it was softened into allegory or dismissed as exaggeration. A shield found in a woman's grave became a ceremonial relic. A queen leading armies was recast as a symbolic figurehead. The feudal system doubled down on this erasure, tying land ownership and military service to male lineage, making the very idea of a woman warrior seem like a contradiction. But history has a way of whispering its secrets. Look beyond the official records, and you'll find traces of truth etched into the margins. Trial documents from of Arc's prosecution reveal not just her persecution, but her tactical brilliance, how she outmaneuvered seasoned generals with her grasp of terrain and morale. Norse sagas, though romanticized, describe like fighting alongside men, their deeds preserved in oral tradition long before monks transcribed them. Even archaeology rebels against the silence. Skeletal remains buried with swords in Scandinavia, female skeletons bearing battle scars in England, frescoes in Spain depicting women alongside knights. These aren't anomalies, they're proof of a reality that parchment tried to suppress. The bias wasn't just about omission, it was about distortion. When women warriors couldn't be ignored, their legacies were twisted to fit societal fears. A victorious queen might be remembered as a seductress, her strategic mind reduced to cunning. A woman who defended her lands became a cautionary tale about unnatural ambition. Yet in the cracks between these distortions, patterns emerge. The same chronicles that scorned warrior women also betrayed their influence. How castles held firm under their command, how rebellions sparked at their words. To understand their true impact, we must read history against its own grain, piecing together fragments like a detective solving a centuries-old mystery. The truth wasn't lost. It was waiting to be reclaimed. Of Arc's story begins not in a castle or a court, but in the quiet fields of, where a teenage girl with no formal education or noble blood heard voices she believed were sent by God. At a time when women were expected to marry young and tend to hearth and home, dared to demand an audience with the Dauphin, the future Charles, the Seventh of France. Imagine the scene: a 17-year-old peasant girl, dressed in men's clothing for practicality and protection, standing before a skeptical prince and his court, declaring she was chosen to save France from English domination. The audacity alone should have ended her story there, but possessed something far more dangerous than a sword: unshakable conviction. Her rise was nothing short of miraculous. Within months, she convinced Charles to grant her command of troops, a role unheard of for a woman, let alone one with no military training. Yet at the siege of leadership shattered expectations. She didn't just inspire soldiers, she outmaneuvered seasoned commanders, exploiting weaknesses in English defenses and rallying French forces to a decisive victory. Her tactical brilliance turned the tide of the entire war, proving her success wasn't just divine luck, but sharp strategic insight. The English, who had mocked her as a witch or a pawn, soon learned to fear the girl they called the Maid. But's greatest strength, her refusal to bend, became her undoing. Captured by Burgundian forces and sold to the English, she faced a trial designed not to deliver justice, but to break her. Her interrogators twisted her visions into heresy, her cross-dressing into sin, and her defiance into proof of madness. Yet even in chains, outwitted them. When asked if she knew she was in God's grace, a theological trap, she replied, "If I am not, may God put me there. If I am, may God keep me there." Her trial transcripts reveal not a fanatic, but a quick-witted young woman defending her beliefs with startling eloquence. Her burning at the stake in Rouen was meant to erase her. Instead, it immortalized her. Within decades, the church that condemned her would declare her a martyr. Today, historians still debate her legacy. Was she a mystic, a military prodigy, or a political symbol weaponized by France? Perhaps she was all three, but one thing is certain. Of Arc refused to be defined by the limits of her gender, her class, or her era. She stepped onto the battlefield, into the halls of power, and onto the pages of history, not as a woman playing a man's role, but as a force that redefined what was possible. Her story isn't just about faith or war. It's about the power of refusing to stay where the world tells you to belong. And yet, was not alone. Across Europe, other women were also rewriting their destinies with steel and wit. Some led armies openly, like the fierce Matilda of Tuscany, while others wielded influence from the shadows, like the cunning of Aquitaine. Their stories, though less known, are no less extraordinary. While of Arc rose from peasantry to legend, Matilda of Tuscany was born into power, yet she wielded it with a fierceness that shattered expectations. Imagine the Italian peninsula in the 11th century, a fractured chessboard of warring city-states and imperial ambitions, where a young noblewoman inherited not just vast lands but an army. While most women of her station were married off for political alliances, Matilda refused to be a pawn. By her 20s, she was commanding troops in full armor, defending Pope Gregory VII against the Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV, a man twice her age who underestimated her at his peril. The Battle of became her masterpiece. Outnumbered and outmaneuvered at first glance, Matilda turned the tide with a daring nighttime assault, catching Henry's forces off guard and scattering them before dawn. Chroniclers of the time, reluctant to credit a woman, still couldn't ignore the sheer audacity of her tactics. But Matilda's genius wasn't confined to the battlefield. She played the long game, fortifying a network of castles across the Apennines, not just as military strongholds, but as symbols of her unyielding authority. Her letters, preserved in archives, reveal a mind sharper than most diplomats of her era. She negotiated directly with popes, brokered treaties, and even mediated between warring factions, all while maintaining her grip on territories stretching from the Po Valley to central Italy. Why, then, does history remember her less vividly than the emperors she humbled? The answer lies in the ink of her detractors. Male chroniclers framed her victories as flukes or attributed them to shadowy male advisors. Even her marriage, first to a man who died mysteriously young, then to a teenager half her age, was weaponized against her, painted as evidence of instability rather than the calculated moves of a ruler securing her dynasty. Yet her legacy lingers in the stones of her castles and the grudging respect of her enemies. Henry IV, forced to kneel in the snow to beg papal forgiveness, did so under Matilda's watchful eye. She wasn't just a warrior, she was the architect of an empire's humiliation. Matilda's story forces us to ask, how many other women's triumphs were buried under the weight of skewed narratives? Whilst fame grew from her martyrdom, Matilda's faded precisely because she succeeded too well, living long enough to see her enemies crushed and her name etched into the foundations of power. Her life reminds us that history's spotlight often misses those who didn't fit its preferred archetypes. Women who ruled as deftly as they fought, their swords and quills equally sharp. Story begins in the shadow of her father's legacy, Alfred the Great, the Saxon king who Viking conquest and laid the foundations of a unified England. But where Alfred fought to survive, his daughter would fight to expand. Born into a world where Viking raids were a constant threat, didn't just inherit a crown, she inherited a war. And unlike so many of her time, she didn't delegate the battle to others. She strapped on armor, armies, and became the architect of Mercia's survival. Take the year 907, when Viking forces surged into English territories, burning villages and seizing land. While other rulers hesitated, acted. She didn't just defend, she built. Under her command, a network of fortified towns sprang up across Mercia, each one a bristling stronghold designed to repel invaders. These weren't mere walls. They were masterpieces of military engineering, placed at strategic river crossings and trade routes to choke off Viking advances. Places like Stafford, Warwick, and became unbreakable knots in a defensive net, forcing the Norse armies to either waste resources on sieges or bypass them entirely. And when the Vikings chose the latter, cavalry would harry their flanks, turning retreats into routs. But her genius wasn't limited to stone and steel. Understood the power of alliances long before diplomacy became a knightly virtue. She married her daughter to the Viking king of York's rival, weaving a web of loyalty that destabilized her enemies from within. She brokered treaties with Welsh kings, not as a subordinate, but as an equal, securing her borders while others squabbled. And when the Norse ruler of East died, she didn't just send condolences. She marched in and reclaimed the lands her father had lost decades earlier. By the time of her death in 918, she'd pushed the frontier of Saxon control farther north than any ruler before her, laying the groundwork for the England we know today. So why is a household name like Alfred or William the Conqueror? The answer lies in the quills of monks who chronicled her era. To them, a woman's victories were inconvenient truths. Some scribes reduced her to a pious figurehead, crediting her brother Edward with her triumphs. Others framed her as an exception, a masculine woman whose success only proved the rule. Yet the voices silenced in English courts still echo elsewhere. Welsh annals call her the most renowned queen of the Saxons. Irish chronicles note her death as a calamity for all Britain. Even Viking skalds, who rarely praised their foes, sang of the Lady of Mercia with grudging respect. The irony is palpable. Achievements were so vast, so undeniable that they couldn't be erased, only sidelined. Her fortified towns still dot the English countryside. The alliances she forged outlasted her by generations. And the blueprint she created, of a ruler who could fight as fiercely as she governed, would inspire queens for centuries to come. In a world that tried to define her by her gender, rewrote the rules, proving that courage and strategy knew no sex. Her legacy isn't just in the lands she won, but in the precedent she set, that a woman could be both a queen and a conqueror. Yet even as we celebrate her, another question lingers. How many other women like have been lost to the selective memory of history? Her story survived because it was too large to ignore. But what of the smaller, quieter rebellions? The women who led in ways that didn't leave behind castles or chronicles? Perhaps that's the true challenge she leaves us, to dig deeper, to listen for the whispers between the lines, and to remember that history is rarely as simple as it seems. Strides out of the sagas like a storm, sword in hand, braids flying, her name whispered with equal parts awe and skepticism. The Icelandic chronicler first etched her story in the 12th century, centuries after the Viking Age, describing a woman who fought so fiercely in battle that even the legendary had to prove himself worthy of her hand in marriage. But here's the twist. Accounts are layered with myth, blending history with the same poetic license that turned into a dragon slayer. So where does the end and the legend begin? The answer might lie beneath the soil of Scandinavia. In Sweden, archaeologists unearthed a 10th century grave labeled 581, a high-status burial filled with swords, shields, arrows, and even game pieces used for military strategy. For over a century, scholars assumed it belonged to a male warrior, until DNA analysis in 2017 revealed the skeleton was female. This wasn't an isolated find. Across Norway and Denmark, similar graves have surfaced, women buried with axes, spears, and the unmistakable markers of combat. These discoveries don't just hint at warrior women. They shatter the stereotype of Viking society as an unbroken patriarchy where men raided while women waited by the hearth. Yet's paradox persists. The sagas paint her as both a lover and a fighter, a woman who led ships and then ruled as a queen. Some historians argue she's a composite, a symbolic figure stitched together from real women's deeds to embody Norse ideals of strength and cunning. Others point to figures like the Viking queen, the deep-minded, who commanded a fleet to Iceland after her husband's death, as possible inspirations. The truth likely lives in the middle. May not have been one woman, but her legend thrived because Viking culture recognized, even celebrated women who passive roles. Consider the Norse concept of the, or while some medieval Christian writers dismissed them as fantastical, Viking poetry and carvings depict women bearing arms as early as the 8th century. A tiny silver figurine from Denmark shows a woman with a braided ponytail gripping a sword and shield, her expression fierce under a rounded helmet. These artifacts suggest that whether was real or not, the idea of her was plausible to the people who wore those helmets and wielded those swords. The blur between legend and history reveals something deeper: how cultures choose to remember their women. In a society that valued deeds over gender, where a farmer could become a king through bravery, why wouldn't a woman's battlefield prowess earn her a saga? The Viking world was far from egalitarian, but its stories, unlike many medieval chronicles, left space for women to be heroes, not just healers or hostages. Its legacy, whether forged in fact or fiction, forces us to reimagine the past not as a monolith of male dominance, but as a tapestry where threads of female agency, though frayed by time, still shimmer. And perhaps that's the real power of her story. Even if never swung a sword in the marshes of Kattegat, her myth endured because it spoke to a truth Viking women knew. That courage wasn't bound by sex, and glory could be won by anyone bold enough to seize it. The sagas didn't invent her, they immortalized a possibility. Its legend cuts through time like the blade of her, swift, precise, and impossible to ignore. Born in 12th century Japan, she stood apart even among the samurai, a woman whose skill in battle was so unparalleled that chronicles described her as worth 1,000 warriors. Picture her on the battlefield, armor gleaming, her weapon a blur as she carved through enemy lines with the same lethal grace as of Arc charging at or Matilda of Tuscany rallying her troops at. Though oceans and cultures separated them, story echoes a truth that transcends borders. Women have always fought, and their exclusion from history is less about reality and more about who held the pen. What makes Tales so striking is how seamlessly it mirrors the struggles of her European counterparts. Like, she served a doomed cause, the war, a conflict that would end with her lord's death and the collapse of their clan. Like, she wasn't just a warrior but a strategist, leading cavalry units and outmaneuvering foes with tactics that left chroniclers in awe. Even the way her story survives feels familiar. Scribes framed her as an exception, a flower among weeds, as if her prowess required justification in a world that couldn't reconcile femininity with ferocity. Yet the tale of the Japan's epic account of the war doesn't shy from her achievements. It recounts how she took heads in battle, how she was the last to flee a lost war, and how she vanished into legend, either dying in combat or retiring to a nunnery, depending on who tells the tale. The parallels between and European warrior women raise a tantalizing question. Why do cultures with no direct contact share such similar archetypes? From Norse to Japanese musha, the motif of the woman warrior appears again and again, often with the same tropes: supernatural skill, loyalty to a male leader, and a legacy that's celebrated but also contained. Historians argue these stories served dual purposes. They acknowledged the reality of women who fought, often out of necessity in societies plagued by constant war, while also reinforcing gender norms by treating them as outliers. Like, became a safe symbol, a woman so extraordinary she couldn't threaten the status. Yet dig deeper, and the differences are just as revealing. Unlike medieval Europe, where women warriors often had to disguise themselves as men, Japan's samurai class had a documented, if rare, tradition of female fighters. Trained alongside men from childhood, her skill honed in a culture that valued Bushido, the way of the warrior, above all else. European women faced heresy trials for wearing armor. Armor was her birthright. This contrast forces us to rethink the narrative of universal oppression. Gender roles weren't monolithic. They bent under the weight of necessity, culture, and individual defiance. Legacy lives in the space between history and myth. Some scholars insist she was a literary device, a composite of several women woven into one flawless heroine. Others point to artifacts like the lightweight armor designed for female warriors, as proof that women like her were real. Perhaps the truth lies in the middle. What matters isn't whether it took 100 heads in battle, but why her story resonated enough to be preserved. Like the ballads of Aquitaine or the sagas of Viking, her tale reveals a hunger, then and now, for models of women who refuse to be passive. In the end, and her European counterparts challenge us to see history not as a series of isolated events, but as a tapestry of shared human struggles. Whether in the cherry blossom-strewn fields of Japan or the rain-slicked battlements of Normandy, women have always found ways to wield power, even when the world insisted their hands were meant for softer things. Their stories, scattered across continents and centuries, are threads in the same defiant pattern, proof that courage wears no single face, and that the pen, no matter who holds it, can never fully erase the sword. When we think of the Crusades, the image that comes to mind is often one of armored knights, zealous clergy, and the clash of empires under the banner of the cross. But look beyond the battle lines, and you'll find women moving through the chaos, not as bystanders, but as vital players in this centuries-long struggle. Take of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful women of the Middle Ages. When she joined the Second Crusade alongside her husband, King Louis VII of France, she didn't travel as a passive observer. Chronicles describe her riding through the mountains of Anatolia in full regalia, her presence a rallying point for troops. Some accounts even suggest she influenced military decisions, though later male historians would dismiss her role as mere meddling, but was no anomaly. Across the Crusader states, women like of Salerno, a Lombard princess trained in warfare, fought beside their husbands in full armor, commanding troops with the same authority as any lord. The Crusades, for all their bloodshed, created unexpected opportunities for women to step into roles that would have been unthinkable in peacetime. With men away for years, or never returning, women managed estates, negotiated with enemy forces, and even defended besieged cities. In the Latin kingdom of Jerusalem, like ruled as regents, wielding power with a shrewdness that kept fragile kingdoms intact. Others served as healers, their knowledge of medicine saving countless lives in the brutal conditions of camp and battlefield. Pilgrimage records from the time reveal women traveling alone or in groups, their journeys as much about survival as spirituality. And then there were those who took up arms themselves. While their numbers were small, traces remain, like the unnamed woman described in a 12th century chronicle who fought disguised as a knight at the siege of Acre, her identity revealed only after her death in combat. But why were these stories so often erased or softened? The answer lies in the tension between necessity and ideology. The church preached that women belonged in domestic roles, yet the desperate reality of war forced exceptions. Chroniclers, torn between recording the truth and upholding doctrine, often downplayed women's contributions or framed them as divine miracles. A woman healing the sick became a saintly figure. A woman wielding a sword became a cautionary tale. Eva's legacy suffered this fate. Her political acumen reduced to scandalous rumors about her love life. Her influence on the crusade overshadowed by her eventual divorce. Yet the fragments that survive paint a far richer picture. Letters from crusader women reveal their strategic minds, like those of who defended Jerusalem's walls during Saladin's siege, later writing vividly of the experience. Archaeological finds: a woman's skeleton buried with a crusader's sword in Cyprus, a medieval hospital ledger listing female physicians, hint at the untold stories beneath the official record. These women weren't anomalies. They were part of the fabric of the Crusades, their lives shaped by the same forces that moved empires. The deeper we dig, the clearer it becomes. The history of the Crusades isn't just a saga of kings and conquests. It's also a story of women who turned the chaos of holy war into a stage for their own agency, whether through diplomacy, healing, or the swing of a blade. Their legacies, though fragmented, challenge us to rethink not just the Crusades, but the very nature of medieval warfare. Because when the dust settled, it wasn't only the men who shaped what came next. The Knights Templar loom large in medieval lore, warrior monks clad in white mantles, sworn to protect pilgrims and hoard secrets. But beneath the myths of hidden treasures and holy relics lies a quieter mystery. Did women ever stand among their ranks? Popular legends whisper of female Templars, shadowy figures who fought alongside men or wielded influence behind the scenes. Yet the historical record is frustratingly opaque, a puzzle pieced together from scattered clues and deliberate omissions. Start with the facts we can verify. The Templar Rule, the order's foundational document, explicitly forbade women from joining as full members. This wasn't unusual. Medieval military orders like the and Teutonic Knights also barred women from combat roles. But dig deeper, and exceptions emerge. Templar estates across Europe relied on, who donated land or wealth in exchange for spiritual benefits. Some, like of in 12th century Catalonia, negotiated remarkable autonomy, even overseeing Templar properties as lay administrators. Then there were the sisters attached to Templar houses as healers or caregivers. Trial records from the Templars' suppression mention women working in infirmaries, their hands skilled in herbal remedies and battlefield medicine. But what of the persistent tales of female warriors? The rumor mill of the Middle Ages churned with stories of women slipping into the order disguised as men, echoing of Arc's later cross-dressing. A handful of trial testimonies, likely coerced, accused the Templars of secretly inducting women into their ranks. One deposed knight claimed to have seen a woman in full armor at a chapter meeting, though historians dismiss this as propaganda concocted to smear the order. More credible are accounts like that of Matilda of Artois, who allegedly financed Templar campaigns and may have trained with their sergeants, blurring the line between patron and participant. The truth may lie in the Templars' unspoken pragmatism. While their official stance mirrored the Church's gender norms, the chaos of the Crusades often forced adaptation. In Outremer, the Templars' stronghold in the Holy Land, women like Lady Morphia negotiated with Muslim leaders and managed supply lines, roles that required tactical acumen. Could some have taken up arms in moments of crisis? The Order's own archives were purged after their fall, leaving only fragments. But consider this. The Templars revered the Virgin Mary as their patron, casting her as a celestial warrior. If they venerated a woman in heaven as their protector, is it so far-fetched that they might have relied on women on earth? The debate reflects a broader tension in medieval society. Women were barred from holy orders yet ran abbeys whereof Aquitaine spent her final years. They couldn't be knights, but inherited castles and commanded garrisons. The Templars, for all their secrecy, were products of their time, bound by doctrine but shaped by necessity. Their legacy, like so much of women's history, exists in the gaps, between the lines of trial transcripts, in the margins of property deeds, and in the stubborn persistence of stories that refuse to be buried. Perhaps the real question isn't whether women wore the white mantle, but why we're so determined to prove they couldn't have. And that ambiguity itself is revealing. In a world that sought to categorize and confine, the Templars' relationship with women, like their famed lost treasures, remains just out of reach, a reminder that history's deepest secrets often lie not in what was written, but in what was carefully left unsaid. Black Randolph stood atop the battlements of Castle, her skirts whipping in the North Sea wind as English arrows clattered harmlessly against the stone. It was the year 1338, and for 5 long months, this fiery Scottish noblewoman had turned her fortress into an unbreakable thorn in England's side. While other castles fell across Scotland, held firm, orchestrating a defense so audacious that chroniclers couldn't decide whether to vilify her or marvel at her cunning. When the English commander, the Earl of Salisbury, demanded her surrender, she reportedly had her maids dust the ramparts with linen sheets in mockery, as if his siege were nothing more than a pesky household chore. What makes story so electrifying isn't just her military brilliance, it's how her gender twisted the narrative of her defiance. Medieval warfare was a stage where men wrote their own heroics, but refused to play by their script. English chroniclers, accustomed to describing women as either victims or trophies in war, scrambled to categorize her. One account painted her as a she-devil, her laughter from the walls unnerving seasoned soldiers. Another, grudgingly respectful, noted how she directed crossbow fire with the precision of a veteran commander. Even her nickname, Black likely referring to her dark hair and complexion, carried a tone of fearful awe, as if her very presence nature. Yet in Scotland, ballads spun her defiance into legend. Where English writers saw unnatural audacity, Scots saw a patriot. One verse celebrated how she held the castle o'er the sea, naught but her wit and a handful o' men. This split in perception reveals the era's double standard. A man defending his home was expected. A woman doing the same became either a monster or a miracle. Weaponized these expectations. Knowing the English would underestimate her, she staged elaborate ruses, having soldiers parade the same helmets along the walls to feign greater numbers, or dropping boulders disguised as precious supplies to lure attackers into traps. Her psychological warfare was as sharp as any blade. The siege's climax came when Salisbury rolled out his secret weapon, a massive battering ram called the Sow, armored against defensive fire. Didn't flinch. As the ram inched toward the gates, she ordered her men to drop a millstone from the battlements, crushing it instantly. Then, in a final flourish, she allegedly tossed down a rose to Salisbury, a gesture dripping with sarcastic grace. The message was clear. This was her domain, and no amount of masculine might could breach it. This triumph forces us to ask, why do we remember her when so many other women's wartime feats were erased? Part of it lies in sheer spectacle. Her defiance was too public, too humiliating to England's pride to be buried. But it's also about who recorded her story. Scottish chroniclers had every reason to immortalize her as a national icon, while English accounts, unable to ignore her, had to explain away their failure. In the end, became a mirror for medieval anxieties about power and gender. A man's defeat could be blamed on tactics. A woman's victory had to be supernatural or sinister. Her legacy lingers not just in crumbling castle stones, but in the uncomfortable questions she raises. How many other women defended homes and kingdoms with the same ferocity, only to have their stories smoothed into something palatable or erased entirely? Randolph refused to be smoothed. She stood on those walls, unapologetic, forcing history to reckon with her. And that, perhaps, was her greatest victory of all. Dipped her quill into ink not just to write, but to rewrite history itself. Born in Venice in 1364 and raised in the French court, she became Europe's first professional woman writer, a voice so sharp it cut through the parchment biases of her time. Picture her in her study, surrounded by manuscripts penned by men who dismissed women as weak or wicked, and imagine her frustration as she read account after account, erasing the very women she knew could wield swords and power with equal skill. Her response: the Book of the City of Ladies, a literary fortress where heroines of the past stood shoulder to shoulder, their stories mortar and stone against the tide of silence. What set apart wasn't just her defiance, but her method. While monks chronicled battles as May-lonely affairs, she combed through ancient texts like a detective, rescuing fragments others overlooked. She celebrated Semiramis, the Assyrian queen who conquered Babylon, and the Amazon who fought Achilles, figures male historians had reduced to myths or morality tales, but went further, weaving contemporary women into her tapestry. Joan of Arc burst onto the scene decades later. His work had already laid the groundwork framing female courage not as aberration, but as lineage. Her genius lay in flipping the script. Male scholars used women's failures to justify their exclusion, used their triumphs to expose the hypocrisy. If women were naturally frail, how did Matilda of Tuscany lead armies? If they lacked reason, how did queens like of Castile govern kingdoms? She didn't just list examples. She built an entire allegorical city, brick by brick, where these women could reside unchallenged. Lady Reason, Lady Rectitude, and Lady Justice guided her pen, personifying the virtues male chroniclers women could possess. The backlash was predictable. Critics dismissed her as bitter or deluded, a woman overstepping her bounds, but anticipated them. In The Treasure of the City of Ladies, she advised women to wield influence subtly if necessary, proving she understood the game better than her detractors. Her legacy isn't just in the stories she saved, but in the precedent she set. History wasn't fixed. It could be questioned, reshaped, even rebuilt. Today, her work reads like a revelation. Pages that once countered medieval misogyny now echo in modern debates about who gets remembered and why. Didn't just document warriors, she became one, her quill her sword, her words her shield. And in the fight to reclaim women's past, her city of ladies still stands, a beacon for those who refuse to let half of history stay buried. Yet her story also begs a darker question. How many other voices like hers were lost? For every, how many manuscripts moldered unread, their ink fading as the narratives men preferred hardened into fact? The silence around them only makes her louder, a reminder that the pen, in the right hands, can be the mightiest weapon of all. Isabella of Castile rode into battle not as a queen playing soldier, but as a sovereign asserting divine right. When the War of Castilian Succession erupted in 1475, she didn't delegate command from a distant palace. She led troops in full armor, her banners fluttering alongside Ferdinand's. But Isabella's brilliance lay in her dual wield of sword and statecraft. While crushing rebellions she simultaneously orchestrated the unification of Spain through marriage alliances and the infamous Alhambra Decree. Her military campaigns against Granada weren't just conquests. They were calculated acts of political theater, demonstrating Christian dominance while consolidating her fractured kingdom. What set Isabella apart wasn't just her battlefield presence, but how she weaponized perception. Knowing contemporaries would balk at a woman besieging cities, she framed her wars as holy missions, wrapping herself in papal approval. When critics whispered that war distorted her femininity, she commissioned portraits emphasizing her delicate features beside battle maps. Even her patronage of Columbus served this balance, projecting piety through conversion while funding exploration that would fill her coffers with New World gold. Isabella mastered the alchemy of medieval power, transforming the limitations of her gender into strengths, making her seem both chosen by God and unstoppable by man. Across the Baltic, of Denmark took a different path to the same destination. Crowned at 10 after her father's death, she spent her adolescence outmaneuvering German nobles who saw her as a puppet. By 20, she'd crushed the rebels at the Battle of, not with brute force, but through tactical patience, luring overconfident knights into marshland, where their heavy armor became a death sentence. True innovation, though, was rewriting the rules of Scandinavian power. Where male rulers expanded through war, she forged the union through diplomacy, uniting Denmark, Norway, and Sweden under her rule while letting each kingdom keep its laws. Her genius, making compromise feel like conquest. These queens shared an unspoken understanding that medieval power was a chessboard where gender could be both obstacle and advantage. Isabella used her piety as a shield against accusations of unwomanly aggression, leveraged her youth to make rivals underestimate her until it was too late. Both faced the same paradox, praised for masculine leadership while being scrutinized for any lapse in feminine virtue. A king could be ruthless and still beloved. A queen had to temper steel with silk. Their legacies force us to reconsider what warrior truly meant in the Middle Ages. For these women, battles weren't just fought with lances and siege engines, but with marriage contracts, religious decrees, and the careful cultivation of image. The chronicles that reduced them to either saints or schemers missed the point entirely. True medieval power wasn't about choosing between the throne room and the battlefield. It was about mastering both, then making the world believe you belonged in neither. And perhaps that's the most subversive lesson they left behind. In eras that insisted women's hands were meant only for prayer wheels or distaffs, these queens proved they could just as easily grasp scepters and swords without dropping either. The image of a medieval woman training with a sword might seem like a scene from a fantasy novel, but scattered across manuscripts and chronicles are glimpses of a reality far more nuanced. Noble girls in castles weren't just taught embroidery and etiquette. Some learned to handle blades with startling proficiency. Take the 12th century manual, Cum, where Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II casually mentions practicing falconry, a sport requiring the same precision and reflexes as archery. Or the Psalter, its margins alive with illustrations of women wielding bows alongside men in hunting parties, their poses too deliberate to be mere artistic whimsy. These weren't anomalies. They were quiet rebellions against the assumption that women's hands were meant only for distaffs and prayer books. Yet the path to martial skill was far from straightforward. While peasant women might pick up a sickle or staff out of necessity, formal training required privilege, and even then, societal limits loomed. A noblewoman's education in combat was often framed as self-defense or hunting, labels that made male guardians more comfortable. Of Aquitaine's court reportedly included female attendants trained in riding and basic swordsmanship, but chroniclers took care to emphasize these were ladylike pursuits, not preparation for war. The distinction was crucial. A woman shooting arrows at deer was acceptable. The same woman aiming at men on a battlefield threatened the natural order. The barriers weren't just ideological, they were physical. Medieval armor and weapons were designed for male bodies, their weight and balance calibrated to muscles built through lifelong training. A teenage noblewoman suddenly handed a broadsword would find it nearly unmanageable without tailored instruction. Yet evidence suggests some overcame this. The tomb effigy of Italian noblewoman Margherita shows her in a gambeson, the quilted armor worn under plate, hinting at practical experience. And in Spain, the Reals of 1385 explicitly permitted women to inherit and maintain family armories, implying at least basic familiarity with their contents. Perhaps the most telling clues lie in the backlash. Church edicts condemning women who dressed as men to practice arms reveal such practices happened enough to warrant condemnation. A 15th century German sermon warns fathers against letting daughters play at swords. lest they develop unseemly ambitions. These warnings, meant to suppress, inadvertently confirm. Wherever there were castles, there were likely girls stealing moments in the yard, testing the weight of a dagger, or mimicking the footwork of knights. The truth is, medieval women's combat training existed in the shadows, not absent, but uncelebrated. Gwen wrote that a woman's heart is no less capable of courage. She wasn't speculating. She was describing what she'd seen, the quiet determination of who refused to be helpless, who turned hunting lessons into martial drills and turned society's excuses into opportunities. Their training might not have filled chronicles, but it filled gaps in castle defenses during sieges, in protecting estates when lords were away, and most of all, in proving that the line between ladylike and warlike was as thin as the edge of a blade. A suit of armor was more than protection. It was a second skin, a declaration of who you were in a world where identity was often written in steel. For women warriors, this posed a unique challenge. How do you wear a symbol of power designed for male bodies in a society that insisted power wasn't yours to claim? The surviving artifacts whisper answers. Take the so-called Venus armor from 16th century Germany, its waist cinched and torso subtly curved, a rare surviving example of plate mail forged with a woman's silhouette in mind. Or the effigy of Italian, her stone likeness clad in a breastplate that flares at the hips, blending martial function with the fashion of her class. These weren't costumes. They were tools of war, tailored for bodies their makers never expected to see on the battlefield. But adaptation went beyond mere fit. Armor became a canvas for negotiation between femininity and ferocity. Of Arc's white harness, commissioned specifically for her, bore no decorative frills. It mirrored the practical gear of male commanders, a silent rebuke to those who questioned her place among soldiers. Contrast this with the ornate armor of Isabella of Castile, etched with religious motifs and her personal symbols, transforming steel into propaganda. Where sought to blend in, Isabella weaponized her visibility, using her suit to remind allies and enemies alike that God sanctioned her rule. Both approaches reveal the same truth. Armor wasn't just worn, it was performed. Yet for every woman who donned plate mail, countless others fought in gambesons or repurposed male gear, their contributions erased by the assumption that armor equaled legitimacy. Archaeology offers glimpses of these overlooked fighters. The battered remains of a 14th century brigandine found in France, its interior straps adjusted for narrower shoulders, suggests hurried adaptations in the field. A fresco in Siena's Palazzo shows a woman in a quilted jacket, her raised sword identical to the men beside her, proof that not all female warriors had the luxury of custom steel. The cultural baggage of armor cut both ways. Chroniclers obsessed over women in mail, their descriptions tinged with titillation or horror. When the Burgundians captured, they made sure to note how she clung to her male garments, as if the clothes themselves were crimes. Yet the same society that recoiled at the idea of a woman in armor also immortalized Saint of Antioch, slaying a dragon in full knightly regalia, her virtue intact. This contradiction reveals medieval Europe's uneasy dance with martial women, able to venerate them as saints or marvels, but never quite accept them as soldiers. Perhaps the most telling detail lies in what didn't survive. No workshop ledgers record the names of smiths who crafted armor for. No guild regulations mention female clients. The adjustments we see, a narrower waist here, a shortened sleeve there, were likely made in secrecy or passed off as eccentricities of wealthy patrons. And that's what makes these artifacts so revolutionary. They weren't just shaped to fit women's bodies. They were shaped despite a world that insisted those bodies didn't belong in battle. Every dent, every scratch, every modified strap whispers the same defiant truth. The warrior's role wasn't given. It was taken. The flames that consumed of Arc and Juan weren't just meant to kill her. They were a warning. A peasant girl who dared to command armies, wear armor and claim divine guidance had to be erased twice over. First her body, then her legacy. But's fate was far from unique. For every woman who picked up a sword in medieval Europe, the consequences of defiance loomed large, their punishments often harsher and more symbolic than those given to men. A male rebel might lose his head for treason. A woman warrior risked having her very identity twisted into something monstrous. Consider the legal machinery arrayed against them. When of Salerno, a Lombard princess who fought alongside her husband Robert was captured by rivals, they didn't just imprison her. They spread rumors she'd used witchcraft to control her troops. Never mind that was trained in warfare from childhood. Her skill had to be explained away as supernatural because the alternative, that a woman could be as strategically brilliant as a man, was unthinkable. This pattern repeats in trial records across Europe. A man's battlefield prowess earned praise. A woman's invited accusations of heresy or demonic pacts. Even victories could be dangerous. After leading the defense of her castle against English forces, the French noblewoman was labeled a she-wolf by chroniclers, her tactical genius recast as animalistic savagery. Exile was another weapon. When the Swedish noblewoman defended her lands against Danish invaders in the 14th century, her success earned her not accolades, but banishment. Male lords who lost battles might negotiate ransoms or swear new oaths. Women-like were often stripped of titles outright, their very presence seen as destabilizing. Sermons from the period reveal the church's role in this silencing. A 15th century German bishop's treatise warned that a woman who takes up arms invites God's wrath upon her household, framing defiance of gender roles as a spiritual crime. Yet the most insidious punishment was slander, the deliberate warping of a woman's story after the fact. Look at how history remembers Matilda of Tuscany. Though she humbled emperors, later chroniclers reduced her to a lovelorn woman pining for the Pope's favor. Or take of Aquitaine, whose political acumen during the Crusades was overshadowed by salacious rumors of affairs. Male rulers could be cruel or cunning and still command respect. Warrior women had their legacies sanded down into palatable myths, seductresses, fanatics, or tragic figures. The difference in punishment wasn't just about the act of fighting, it was about what that act represented. A man with a sword upheld the social order. A woman with one threatened to unravel it. That's why trial fixated on her clothing as much as her heresy, why Saga had to frame her as lover first and a warrior second. To acknowledge these women as equals would have cracked the foundations of medieval society. Their real crime wasn't bearing arms, it was proving that the world could be different. And for that, history made sure they paid the highest price. But here's what the burnings and the lies couldn't extinguish: the stubborn fact of their existence. Every trial record, every defamatory chronicle, every sermon railing against unwomanly behavior inadvertently confirmed the truth that women fought, led, and refused to vanish. The punishments meant to erase them became, in the end, their loudest testament. Marriage in the medieval world was never just about love. It was a chess move, a treaty written in vows and dowries. For women warriors, the stakes were even higher. A wedding ring could be a crown or a cage, depending on who held the keys. Take Matilda of Tuscany, who turned her 2 marriages in political maneuvering. Her first union with the hunchback, though likely arranged, gave her control of vast Lombard territories. When he died young under suspicious circumstances, whispers followed, but Matilda didn't linger in the shadows. She shocked Europe by marrying a teenager, Welf of Bavaria, a move that secured her southern borders against imperial encroachment. Chroniclers sneered, calling it desperation, but the truth was colder and sharper. Matilda had turned matrimony into a weapon, swapping vows like knights swapped swords on the battlefield. The Lady of Mercia played the game differently. Widowed young, she could have been forced into remarriage by her brother, King Edward of Wessex. Instead, she ruled alone for nearly 3 decades, her authority unchallenged. Here's the twist: her widowhood became her strength. Without a husband, she wasn't a consort or a stepping stone for male ambition. She was sovereign. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records her victories without once mentioning a man's oversight. When she fortified towns or crushed Viking armies, the credit was hers alone. Yet Even's autonomy had its limits. She never officially took the title of queen, perhaps aware that a crown would invite more scrutiny than the quieter power she wielded. The contrast between these women reveals a brutal truth. Marital status dictated the battlefield. A married woman like Matilda had to navigate the minefield of shared authority, using her husband's name when convenient and sidestepping it when necessary. An unmarried or widowed ruler faced fewer chains, but also fewer shields. Without a spouse, she bore every attack, every diplomatic slight, without the buffer of alliance. Neither path was free. Both required calculation. Then there were those who the board entirely. Of Arc famously rejected marriage altogether, her virginity becoming both armor and banner. For her, matrimony would have meant surrendering the divine mandate she claimed. Meanwhile, of Aquitaine used her marriages to 2 kings as stepping stones, only to later lead rebellions against both. The pattern is clear. Whether these women embraced marriage, avoided it, or weaponized it, their choices were never passive. Each ring, or lack thereof, was a tactical decision scribbled in the margins of history by hands that refused to be bound. The real question is whether these women were wives or widows. It's how they reshaped the rules of the game. Matilda's marital gambits let her outmaneuver emperors. Widowhood became the blank parchment on which she wrote her own legacy. Their stories force us to rethink medieval power structures not as rigid hierarchies, but as fluid systems where a woman's worth was constantly negotiated, and where the boldest among them learned to do the negotiating themselves. Siege warfare wasn't just a test of strength, it was a theater of the mind, and women like Black Randolph knew how to command the stage. Picture the scene: English forces surrounding castle, confident their siege engines and numbers would break the defenders. But turned the walls into her own chessboard, playing not just with weapons, but with perception. When Salisbury's men launched boulders at the ramparts, She had her maids appear in pristine white aprons, casually dusting the battlements as if the attack were nothing more than a minor nuisance. This wasn't just defiance, it was psychological warfare, designed to unnerve and humiliate. The message was clear: your might means nothing here. Brilliance lay in understanding that sieges were as much about morale as they were about muscle. While male commanders relied on battering rams and starvation tactics, women defenders often exploited the theater of the siege itself. Take La, Castellan of Lincoln Castle, who staged lavish feasts atop the walls during a siege in 1216, roasting meat so the aroma taunted the hungry forces below. Or who during the Breton War of Succession ordered her troops to light extra torches at night, creating the illusion of reinforcements arriving. These weren't desperate gestures. They were calculated moves to sow doubt and buy time. Chroniclers, though often grudging, couldn't ignore the ingenuity of these women. Mockery of Salisbury's battering ram, crushing it with a millstone before tossing a rose, wasn't just a flourish. It was in undermining an enemy's confidence. Similarly, when the Countess of defended during the same Breton conflict, she didn't just rally troops. She rode through the gates in full armor, leading a surprise cavalry charge that shattered the enemy's complacency. These women grasped a truth many male commanders missed. In a siege, the defenders held the high ground not just physically, but psychologically. The tactics women pioneered reveal a deeper understanding of warfare's human element. Where men might focus on fortifications and supplies, women manipulated time, perception, and even gender expectations to their advantage. Salisbury expected a demure noblewoman. Instead, he faced a strategist who used his own assumptions against him. This duality, being underestimated yet, became their secret weapon. What's striking is how often these stories were framed as anomalies. Chroniclers marveled at women's unwomanly cunning, as if strategy itself were a masculine trait. But the frequency of such accounts suggests otherwise. From the Welsh princess, who led nighttime sorties against Norman invaders, to the Italian noblewoman, who famously lifted her skirts to mock besiegers threatening her children, the pattern is clear. Women didn't just endure sieges, they redefined them, turning the very act of defense into an art form. And perhaps that's the real lesson these women leave us. Siege warfare, often remembered as a brutish clash of wills, was also a canvas for creativity, one where the defenders who thrived weren't always the strongest, but the cleverest. In a world that told them their place was behind barred gates, these women proved the gates themselves could be weapons. Of Arc's canonization centuries after her burning raises a haunting question. Why did the same church that condemned her as a witch later declare her a saint? The answer lies in the razor-thin line medieval Christianity drew between holy women and dangerous ones. Voices from God, once evidence of demonic deception, became divine revelation once France and the Church found political value in her legend. But for every elevated to sainthood, there were dozens like Marguerite, a mystic whose writings on spiritual freedom saw her burned at the stake in 1310. Both women claimed direct communion with the divine, yet one was, while the other was erased. The difference wasn't doctrine, it was who stood to benefit from their stories. Religious texts of the era reveal this double standard in ink. The Bible's Deborah, a prophetess who led armies, was celebrated, Yet medieval theologians insisted she was an exception, proving the rule. Saint of Alexandria's legendary martyrdom included her defeating pagan scholars in debate, but artists always depicted her with a wheel, the symbol of her torture, not her intellect. Meanwhile, women like of Milan, who preached equality in Christ, were branded heretics for threatening the clergy's male monopoly on spiritual authority. The pattern was clear. Faith could justify a woman's violence only if it served existing power structures. As victories preserved France, Marguerite's ideas threatened the church itself. The machinery of sainthood amplified this divide. Canonization required miracles, but also political allies. When Matilda of Tuscany died in 1115, her supporters immediately pushed for her sainthood, citing her defense of the papacy. Yet her cause stalled, not for lack of piety, but because her martial prowess made Rome uneasy. Contrast this with Saint Clare of Assisi, who was swiftly canonized for her passive devotion to poverty. The message was unmistakable. A woman's holiness was safest when it didn't cross into realms reserved for men. Yet some women weaponized this hypocrisy. Of, though no warrior, wielded visions to command bishops and emperors alike, her divine authority shielding her from accusations of overreach. Herself, during her trial, turned scripture against her accusers, quoting letters that God is no respecter of persons to justify her mission. These women understood that in a world where gods will trump human law, claiming divine mandate could be the ultimate armor, if you survived long enough for history to vindicate you. The relics left behind tell their own story. As reconstructed standard hangs in French cathedrals, Marguerite's books were burned with her body. The line between saint and sinner wasn't drawn by God, but by men who knew that stories of warrior women could inspire or unravel entire worldviews. What made a woman's violence holy or heretical wasn't the sword in her hand, but whose throne it protected. The legend of the Amazons, those fierce women warriors of ancient myth, never truly vanished from the European imagination. By the Middle Ages, their stories had seeped into the cultural bloodstream, shaping how medieval societies viewed women who dared to pick up a sword. But were these warrior women seen as glorious exceptions or dangerous aberrations? The answer lies in the uneasy dance between fascination and fear that played out in art, literature, and even legal codes. Take the medieval illuminated manuscripts that ancient Greek tales. Scribes meticulously illustrated scenes of Amazons battling heroes like Hercules, their bodies clad in armor, their faces as determined as any knight. Yet look closer, and you'll notice subtle changes. In some depictions, their features grow sharper, almost grotesque, their strength twisted into something unnatural. A 12th century bestiary might praise their skill in battle, only to add a footnote warning that such women abandoned the gentle nature of their sex. The message was clear. Admiration came with conditions. Literature of the time reveals the same tension. Ever the iconoclast included Amazons in the Book of the City of Ladies as proof of women's innate capability. But elsewhere, they became cautionary symbols. In the Romance of Alexander, Amazon queens are portrayed as both alluring and lethal, beautiful enough to seduce the conqueror, but ultimately doomed because their society inverted the natural order. Even who led in real life faced these comparisons. When of Aquitaine accompanied the Second Crusade, Critics whispered she led a court of Amazons, as if her retinue of ladies-in-waiting were a battalion in disguise. The church's response was even more revealing. Sermons condemned the Amazonian heresy, not an actual doctrine, but a term for any woman who overstepped. A bishop's treatise from 1324 railed against noble daughters who imitate those heathen women of old, believing themselves equal to men in all things. Yet the same clergy preserved stories of saint and saint, whose martial virtues were, but only because they served God's will, not their own. Artifacts tell a quieter story. A 14th century chess set discovered in Normandy substitutes Amazons for queens, their pieces crowned but wielding axes. A stained glass window in Chartres shows an Amazon alongside biblical heroines, her presence both celebrated and contained. These contradictions weren't accidents. They reflected a society grappling with an uncomfortable truth. If women could fight as well as men, what did that say about the divine hierarchy that justified feudal power? Perhaps the most telling evidence lies in the laws. Statutes from medieval Germany and France barred women from wearing armor or carrying weapons, unless defending their homes during a siege. The loophole was deliberate. Women's violence was acceptable only when it served men's interests, just as Amazons in epics were noble only when they ultimately submitted or died. The myth endured not because medieval people believed in literal warrior tribes, but because it became a mirror for their deepest anxieties about power, gender, and the fragile lines between them. And that's the paradox at the heart of it all. The Amazons were invoked to shame women into submission, yet their legend also gave permission, a whispered reminder that the past held models of strength too potent to fully erase. Every time a noblewoman picked up a sword or a peasant girl stood her ground, she became part of that unbroken lineage, whether the chroniclers admitted it or not. The myths didn't just shape perceptions of warrior women. They became weapons in the silent war over who got to define what was possible. In the medieval world, wealth wasn't just about gold or silks. It was the key to unlocking martial power, and women who controlled land held that key with a firmer grip than many realized. Take Matilda of Tuscany, whose vast estates across northern Italy didn't just fill her coffers. They funded armies, fortified castles, and bankrolled the very wars that shaped empires. Her resources allowed her to field thousands of troops, pay mercenaries, and maintain a network of strongholds that withstood imperial sieges for decades. But Matilda's story wasn't unique. Across Europe, landowning women turned their fortunes into fortresses, their dowries into diplomatic leverage, and their estates into engines of war. Property records from the period tell a revealing tale. In England, the Domesday Book, William the Conqueror's great survey of landholdings, lists women like Countess Judith of Lens holding vast swaths of territory, their names scribbled alongside knights and barons. These weren't passive inheritances. When Judith's lands were threatened by rebellion, she didn't wait for a male relative to intervene. She raised levies and financed the defense herself. Similarly, in Spain, the will of Mayor of Castile shows her diverting funds from her dowry to rebuild walls around her towns, a practical investment in security that doubled as a statement of autonomy. Dowries, often dismissed as mere marital transactions, became covert tools of influence. When of Burgundy married into the Aquitaine dynasty, her dowry included not just land, but the loyalty of armed vassals, men who would later rally to her cause when she defended her son's inheritance against rival claimants. In Scandinavia, commemorate women like the Proud, who used her wealth to commission ships for raiding parties, blurring the line between merchant and warlord. These women understood what chroniclers often ignored. Money could buy swords as easily as silks, and a well-funded defense could outlast even the fiercest siege. The mechanics of this economic power were strikingly practical. Estate rolls from medieval France show, like of personally approving budgets for garrison wages and arrow shipments. In Germany, abbesses, who controlled vast monastic lands, maintained their own armed retainers, their account books meticulously recording payments for and crossbow bolts. Even widows, often portrayed as vulnerable, wielded unexpected clout. When inherited Brittany's ducal treasury, she didn't just mourn her late husband. She bankrolled a civil war, her coins buying the loyalty of knights who might otherwise have hesitated to follow a woman into battle. Yet this financial agency was a double-edged sword. The same wealth that enabled martial power also made these women targets. Inheritance disputes could turn deadly. Of Aquitaine's vast holdings made her a pawn in a continental power struggle, while Italian-like faced constant threats to their estates. Tax records reveal the precarious balance. A woman's ability to fund armies depended on her ability to hold her lands against rivals, legal challenges, or outright confiscation by kings wary of female power. What's most striking is how these women's financial footprints defy stereotypes. Their account books don't dwell on jewels or tapestries, but on grain stores for sieges, payments to armorers, and loans to hire Swiss pikemen. The myth of the frivolous medieval noblewoman crumbles under the weight of these ledgers, where every entry underscores a simple truth. Wealth wasn't just for display, it was for survival. And in a world where land meant soldiers and soldiers meant power, these women didn't just inherit fortunes, they weaponized them. The tapestry stretches 70 meters long, a grand narrative of the Norman conquest stitched in vibrant wool. Yet in its entire epic sweep, only 3 women appear. One mourns a dead king, another flees a burning house, and the third, well, she's literally nameless, labeled merely a woman. This glaring absence speaks volumes. Here was a defining moment in medieval history, a clash of armies and dynasties, and the needlework that memorialized it all but erased women from the battlefield. But turn from the tapestry to the troubadours, songs, and suddenly warrior women are everywhere lionized in verse, their swords flashing as brightly as their virtue. This contradiction, between art that silenced and ballads that exalted, reveals the medieval world's uneasy dance with women who fought. Take the chanson Roland, where the Muslim queen is portrayed with a complexity rare for her time, defiant, strategic, and ultimately sympathetic. Contrast that with the Roman Silence, a 13th century poem about a girl raised as a male knight, where the climax hinges on her exposure and return to proper femininity. These weren't just stories, they were cultural. When troubadours sang of the legendary Saxon warrior, they emphasized her piety, softening her martial prowess with reminders of her prayers. Meanwhile, church frescoes depicted biblical heroines like Judith slaying Holofernes, but always with a demure expression, as if the act of violence required divine justification to be palatable. The biases run deeper than mere omission. In illuminated manuscripts, women defending castles are often shown in the background, their contributions framed as desperate last stands rather than strategic leadership. A 15th century Flemish painting of the Siege of Jerusalem includes a woman dropping a stone on attackers, but she's placed beside children, as if to imply her violence was maternal instinct, not martial skill. Even of Arc's iconic portrayals split along ideological lines. French miniatures show her armored and resolute, while Burgundian artists depicted her as a wild-eyed fanatic. Yet for every dismissive brushstroke, there's a counterpoint. The Cantigas, a collection of Galician songs, celebrates a noblewoman who dons armor to rescue her husband from Moorish captors, her bravery framed as miraculous rather than transgressive. Norse sagas, transcribed by Christian monks, couldn't help but preserve Like, who demanded her ancestral sword from her father's ghost in a scene so visceral it sanitization. These outliers matter because they prove the erasure wasn't total, just selective. The real revelation lies in what these depictions cost. When a tapestry like the ignores women's roles, it doesn't just reflect bias, it perpetuates it, shaping how future generations remember or forget their contributions. But when a song like Dame praises a lady for holding her tower against 100 lances, it plants a seed. The idea that courage isn't gendered, even if society insists otherwise. The tension between these portrayals isn't accidental. It's the sound of a culture arguing with itself, trying to reconcile its reverence for Virgin Marys with its fear of women who wielded real swords. And perhaps that's the most telling detail of all. The same society that buried women's battlefield deeds in silence also kept resurrecting them in art, as if unable to fully extinguish the truth. Every stitch in the tapestry, every note in the ballad, whispers the same uncomfortable lesson. You can try to erase warriors from history, but you can't stop people from imagining them. Of Aquitaine didn't just raise sons, she forged kings. When Henry the Young and Richard Lionheart were boys, their mother didn't tuck them in with fairy tales. She taught them battle formations through chess, using the board to illustrate how cavalry could flank infantry at. This wasn't idle play. It was grooming heirs for a world where power flowed through the sword. This approach reveals a startling truth. For medieval, motherhood wasn't separate from warfare. It was another theater of war. The family chronicles of noble houses overflow with these quiet revolutions. Matilda of Tuscany, though childless herself, meticulously trained her nephew in, turning him into a commander who would later defend her fortresses. In the William of recounts how Empress Matilda, herself a battlefield survivor, drilled her son Henry II in logistics, ensuring he understood that wars were won not just with bravery, but with well-stocked granaries and paid mercenaries. These women knew that, in a world where inheritance could be challenged by steel, their children's survival depended on martial fluency. But the lessons went beyond swordplay. The Angevin Chronicles describes schooling Richard in the art of chivalric spectacle, how to stage tournaments that doubled as military training, how to use heraldry to stoke loyalty among vassals. Meanwhile, in Castile, of England taught her daughters diplomacy through defense contracts, showing how to negotiate with Genoese and German miners for siege tunnels. For these women, parenting was legacy building, each lesson layering another stone in the fortress of their family's future. The tension between nurture and militarization surfaces in personal letters. Of's correspondence with her son reveals her insistence that he master both Latin and for words win arguments, but spears win kingdoms. In Byzantium, Annus Alexiad portrays her mother secretly tutoring her brother John in naval tactics, despite their father's belief that strategy was no pursuit for a child. These fragments suggest a hidden curriculum, where balanced societal expectations with the unspoken truth. Their children's lives might depend on skills they weren't supposed to teach. Archaeology adds another layer. The tomb of a noblewoman in Champagne buried with her son holds not just jewels, but a practice arming sword sized for a teenager, its hilt worn from small hands. In Denmark, commemorate mothers like who gave her son his first shield, a phrase that implies ceremony and solemnity. Even toys carried martial weight. A 13th century wooden knight figurine found in England bears the carved initials of its owner, a boy whose mother was Quincy, a known patron of arms manuals. The Church's discomfort with this practice lingers in sermons. A 12th century bishop's rant against mothers who make their children's cradles into armories betrays how widespread it was. But the most telling evidence comes from the children themselves. When young, the 11th of Castile penned a memoir crediting his mother Maria with teaching him to read a battlefield as clearly as a psalter. He wasn't confessing something shameful. He was boasting. This was the paradox these women navigated, preparing sons, and sometimes daughters, for a violent world while maintaining the fiction of maternal softness. Their success is measured in dynasties that endured, in sons who credited their battlefield instincts to childhood lessons at their mother's knee. The greatest military educations of the Middle Ages didn't always happen in the training yard. Sometimes they began in the nursery. The chronicles of medieval warfare are filled with the clashing swords of knights and the battle cries of, but beneath their polished armor lies a shadow army history barely acknowledges. The peasant women who fought not for glory, but for survival. While scribes meticulously recorded the deeds of queens and heiresses, the contributions of these ordinary women were often reduced to whispers in or buried in the dry ink of tax records. Yet when enemy forces stormed their villages, when fields burned and children screamed, these women didn't merely flee. They picked up scythes, boiling pitch, and whatever else they could wield to defend their homes. Take the English Rising of 1381, when thousands of peasants revolted against oppressive taxes. Official accounts focus on men like Wat Tyler, but court rolls from Essex list women like among the rebels, her name scribbled beside fines for breaking into manors and raising arms. Then, there's the German Peasants' War of 1525, where woodcuts show women hurling stones from rooftops alongside their husbands. These weren't isolated acts of desperation. They were part of a pattern. When the French town of was besieged in 1472, civic records note that the wives of weavers and bakers formed bucket brigades to douse fires and carried wounded men from the walls. Their labor was essential, yet their names are lost, their bravery folded into collective terms like the townsfolk. Folklore offers tantalizing glimpses of what documents omit. Breton ballads sing of the Fearless, a fisherwoman who led a band of villagers to ambush English raiders, her sword allegedly forged from a broken anchor. In Sweden, the tale of the Goose Girl tells of a shepherdess who disguised herself as a boy to join a local militia, her identity revealed only after she fell in battle. These stories, dismissed as fantasy by later historians, often contain kernels of truth. Archaeologists excavating mass graves from the Battle of in 1361 found female skeletons among the dead, their bones bearing the same brutal sword wounds as the men. One woman's remains showed a healed fracture along her forearm, the telltale mark of someone who'd learned to deflect blows long before her final stand. The silence in official records speaks volumes. Manorial court documents from medieval England include fines levied against women for bearing arms unlawfully, suggesting authorities saw their participation as common enough to regulate. In Florence, sumptuary laws barred peasant women from wearing certain fabrics unless they'd contributed to the city's defense, in which case they earned the right to don a scarlet sash. Even tax exemptions hint at their roles. In 14th century Normandy, villages that repelled raids sometimes had their levies reduced, with scribes noting the vigilance of the womenfolk as a factor. Why does this matter? Because every time we assume medieval warfare was solely the domain of armored elites, we erase the resilience of women who fought with no expectation of fame or reward. They didn't need chivalric ballads to justify their actions. Survival was cause enough. When a castle's lady directed defenses from the ramparts, it was the peasant women below who hauled stones to patch breaches. When knights clashed on open fields, it was their wives and daughters who guarded the livestock, and sometimes the village itself, with hay forks and hearth knives. The true measure of their courage isn't in the parchment chronicles, but in the stubborn persistence of their memory. In the way French vineyards still tell of La Defiance, the old woman who poisoned a band of mercenaries with tainted wine. In the Catalan proverb warning invaders that even the hens peck when the fox is in the coop. These women may lack the grand epitaphs of nobles, but their legacy lingers in the unbroken spirit of communities they helped protect. They fought not for crowns or castles, but for the simple, unrecorded dignity of home, and that perhaps is the most universal battle of all. Beneath the quiet earth of a Swedish burial mound, archaeologists brushed away centuries of soil to reveal a skeleton surrounded by swords, shields, and the bones of war horses, a warrior's grave by any measure. Then came the DNA analysis, and history shuddered. The bones belonged to a woman. This wasn't an isolated find. From Norway to England, modern science is peeling back layers of bias, one grave at a time, forcing us to confront a truth medieval scribes tried to bury. Women didn't just witness battles, they fought in them. Take the discovery at Sweden, where the warrior dubbed 581 lay for over 1,000 years, her identity obscured by assumptions. When osteologists first examined her in the 19th century, they saw the weapons and declared her male without question. It took 21st century DNA testing to correct the record, proving she was not only a woman, but a high-ranking tactician buried with game pieces used for military strategy. This wasn't a fluke. In Norfolk, England, another female skeleton was found with a brutal axe wound to the skull, evidence she'd faced combat head-on. Even more telling, her burial included a silver Thor's hammer pendant, a symbol of martial honor in Viking culture. These graves aren't anomalies, they're proof of a pattern archaeology can no longer ignore. The real revolution lies in the tools reshaping our understanding. Isotope analysis now traces the origins of weapons, revealing how far these women traveled. CT scans detect in bones, distinguishing between the wear of farming and the specific injuries of combat. In Denmark, researchers studying a remains found muscle attachments so pronounced they indicated years of wielding heavy weapons. Meanwhile, forensic facial reconstruction, like the hauntingly lifelike rendering of a battle casualty, puts human faces to these long silent fighters. Science isn't just filling gaps in history, it's dismantling the very framework that made those gaps possible. But why did it take so long to see what was literally beneath our feet? The answer is as much about modern bias as medieval. Early archaeologists, steeped in Victorian ideals, often dismissed weapons in female graves as ceremonial or symbolic. A spear became a walking stick, a sword an heirloom. Even when confronted with undeniable evidence, like the Lithuanian queen's grave containing armor and a bent sword, clearly used in battle, scholars insisted she must have been buried with her husband's gear. It's a reminder that history isn't just written by the winners, it's filtered through the assumptions of those who dig it up. Now the tide is turning. Projects like the Female Fighters Database catalog warrior women's graves across Europe, mapping their distribution against trade routes and battle sites. In Germany, a recent re-examination of a 7th century cemetery found 30% of weapon graves belonged to women, their injuries matching those of male combatants. Even the tools of domesticity are being. That distaff in a Saxon grave. It might actually be a seax, a single-edged knife used in close combat. The line between hearth and battlefield is blurring, and with each discovery, the old narratives crumble. The implications ripple beyond academia. When a 10-year-old girl visiting the British Museum sees a reconstruction of the warrior and asks, "Did girls fight too?" the answer is no longer a hesitant maybe. It's a resounding yes, backed by steel and bone. Archaeology isn't just correcting the past, it's reshaping the future, one shattered assumption at a time. The graves have been speaking all along. We're finally learning to listen. The struggles of medieval warrior women might seem worlds away from modern battles for equality, but their stories pulse with lessons that resonate today. Think about Joan of Arc, the peasant girl who shattered expectations by leading armies, only to be burned for defying the roles assigned to her. Centuries later, women still face backlash for stepping into spaces deemed masculine, whether in boardrooms or battlefields. The pattern is hauntingly familiar. Competence met with scrutiny, authority questioned with a tone of surprise. Yet's legacy, her refusal to shrink, echoes in every woman who persists despite being told she doesn't belong. Consider how Matilda of Tuscany wielded diplomacy alongside her sword, negotiating with popes and emperors while maintaining her military edge. Her dual mastery of soft and hard power mirrors the modern demand for women to be assertive but not aggressive, strong but not intimidating. The balancing act hasn't changed, only the battlefield has. Today's leaders, like Germany's or New Zealand's, navigate similar tightropes, their every decision dissected through a gendered lens. Matilda's strategy, leveraging both her intellect and her armor, offers a blueprint for navigating systems still skewed against women's authority. Then there's the Lady of Mercia, who transformed widowhood from a vulnerability into a source of strength. In an era when unmarried women were often pawns, she ruled alone, fortifying towns and forging alliances without a king by her side. Her story speaks directly to single mothers and female entrepreneurs today, proving that societal limitations can become for autonomy. The resilience of women who built infrastructure, not just defenses, reminds us that true power lies in creating something enduring, even when the world expects you to falter. The warrior women of the Middle Ages also teach us about the cost of visibility. Take Black Randolph, mocked for defending her castle like a man, or of Salerno, dismissed as a witch for her battlefield brilliance. Their vilification mirrors the modern smear campaigns against outspoken women, labeled difficult or hysterical for the same traits celebrated in men. The playbook hasn't been rewritten, it's just been translated. Yet these women's refusal to back down, even when their reputations were weaponized against them, underscores a timeless truth. Progress often demands wearing the scars of being first. Perhaps the most potent lesson lies in how these women's stories were nearly erased. Like the warrior buried with her sword, only to be mislabeled for a millennium, countless contributions by women today go uncredited, whether in scientific research, artistic innovation, or grassroots activism. The medieval scribes who downplayed female agency had their counterparts in algorithms that overlook women's work or historians who frame them as exceptions. Recognizing this pattern is the first step toward rewriting it. The thread connecting these women across time isn't just their defiance, but their ability to redefine what's possible. When built her city of ladies in ink, she wasn't just documenting history, she was creating a handbook for resistance. Today, that city has expanded into hashtags, unions, and courtrooms where women demand equal pay, reproductive rights, and an end to violence. The weapons have changed, but the war remains the same. And just as medieval women found cracks in the fortress of patriarchy to slip through, their modern counterparts continue to pry those cracks wider. One law, one protest, one unapologetic step forward at a time. Their greatest gift to us isn't just inspiration, but proof. No system is unbreakable when enough determined hands press against its walls. From fiery resolve to Matilda's unyielding command, these women didn't just navigate the battlefield, they redefined it. Their swords carved through steel and stereotype alike, proving that courage isn't inherited through blood or bound by gender, but forged in the moments when the world says, impossible. For centuries, their stories were tucked into footnotes or twisted into myths, not because they were outliers, but because their very existence unsettled the narratives that painted history as a stage for men alone. Yet here's the truth that refuses to stay buried. The past was never that simple. Take of Arc's trial, where her fixated on her clothing as much as her heresy, proof that her real crime wasn't defying the church, but defying expectation. Or Matilda of Tuscany, whose military genius was recast as mere stubbornness, her victories credited to luck or male advisors. Even the strategist who built the fortresses that shaped England was remembered as her father's daughter rather than a ruler in her own right. The pattern is unmistakable. When women's contributions couldn't be ignored, they were minimized. When they couldn't be minimized, they were mythologized. And when they couldn't be mythologized, they were erased. But the echoes of their defiance linger, not just in crumbling castles or faded manuscripts, but but in the questions they force us to ask. Who decides what counts as history? Whose bravery gets celebrated, and whose gets labeled as legend? Every time we uncover a grave like Warrior Woman or decipher a chronicle like City of Ladies, we're reminded that the past is far more textured than we've been taught. These women weren't exceptions to the rule. They were proof that the rule was always a fiction. So how do we honor them? Not just by remembering their names, but by challenging the silence that still surrounds so many others. For every Matilda, there were countless women whose battles went unrecorded, peasant women who defended villages with scythes, mothers who taught their sons to wield swords, healers who mended wounds in the aftermath of war. Their absence from the record isn't proof they didn't exist, it's proof of who held the pen. That's why these stories matter, not as relics, but as reminders. When we celebrate them, we're not just dusting off the past, we're reshaping the future. Every time a girl learns about Black mocking her besiegers or riding into battle, the world expands a little. History isn't fixed. It's a conversation, and we're all invited to add our voices. Now it's your turn. Whose story resonates with you? Is its mythical ferocity or the quiet resilience of women who built kingdoms while history looked the other way? Drop your favorite warrior's tale in the comments, because the more we share these legacies, the harder they are to ignore. And if you're hungry for more hidden chapters, hit subscribe. Together, let's keep unearthing the past, one defiant woman at a time.